This is going to be one of those videos that kind of amalgamates a number of issues I've spoken about before, but I think it's very important to lay out my position because this is something that is really defining our society, I think. The culture wars I'm referring to. But I'm going to be a little bit more specific and talk about one side of that. Um, I want to be clear here, this video was not intended to defend conservatism. I'm not conservative, at least not on most issues. Probably one area where I don't mind labeling myself a conservative is on crime, because I've made no secret of my views on that. Um, that's an area where I'm conservative and I don't mind saying so. But as a general thing, I'm certainly not a conservative in the party political sense, not even in the ideological sense. I would be. I'm a centrist, but I know that could be a bit vague for a lot of people. But I guess we could say classic liberal in some ways. Yeah, I believe in egalitarianism. I believe in Western liberal democracy. I believe in plurality of opinion. I believe in moderate secularism. These are the things I believe in. Um, with that, there are some conservative views I agree with. There are some left-leaning views I agree with. Dare I say it, even some democratic socialist views I agree with. Um, so that this is where I end up, somewhere in the middle. Um, but one thing that it's inescapable is that we are in an era of great partisan feelings. Now, to some extent, there's always partisanism, in democratic politics. See this on both sides of the Atlantic. You can take any British general election or American presidential election, and of course, there's going to be rigorous debate. Of course, there's going to be um, points of contention. I do think that the last, let's say, roughly 5 years, roughly the late 2010s onwards, it really has got to a new level of divide, particularly in the United States, but by extension in the United Kingdom as well. Um, because I think that we've had a lot of overlap, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Well, it's not a good thing. There's no question about it. It's not a good thing, but it is a reality, and it's a reality that we have to confront. So with that, one of the things that has arisen is what I would call new wokeism. Now there's an interesting phenomenon with this because the left is now seeing woke when it's used by critics as an insult, but the word itself was originally coined by, as I understand it, and I'm open to be corrected here, but as I understand it, the origins of the term go back to people like James Baldwin and others in the American Civil Rights Movement, or the breakout from the Civil Rights Movement, let's say, particularly Black identitarianism, and particularly in the 1970s, that era of you know, uh, black identitarianism was really becoming a thing. And to be woke was to be awoken to the ideas of justice and injustice. Um, so, looking at that context, woke was understandable. It was because after Martin Luther King was assassinated, a lot of those who had been in the moderate ground of the civil rights movement took the view, well, MLK tried the pacifist approach and he got killed. And they did go for a more militant hardline approach. And that's why the Black Panther movement was galvanized in the late 60s and up to the mid 70s. Um, I think we can see definite echoes between Black Lives Matter and the Black Panthers. I think there are quite a lot of similarities, even looking at the increasingly militant imagery that Black Lives Matter activists use these days. Um, However, I also think that the new woke is even more absolutist and Puritan, and they go well beyond just ideas of race. It's not that I agree with the Black Panthers, but I give them some leeway because I can see why that developed. Now, with Black Lives Matter, it initially formed in 2013 by the cases around police brutality and the number of unarmed black men who were being killed in the United States. But it's now morphed into something else. And there's a lot of overlap here. There's overlap, for example, with critical race theory and with a very, very left wing school of thought that proposes such ideas as white privilege. This goes back actually to the 1980s. It's not an entirely new thing. But what we're seeing is it's been particularly galvanized, I would say, in the last 5 years. Um, we look at the 1980s with the rise of political correctness, and that was kind of used as part of the culture wars of that time. But I would say new wokeism. I'm talking about new wokeism here. This recent ideology that's developed. It goes well beyond political correctness. I mean, I don't like political correctness, but I think new wokeism is far, far more egregious. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I love it actually. I think it has a very negative influence on society, and I think it warrants a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism over its manipulation, over its um, absolutism in particular. Now, you can have a particular subject that people feel very strongly about, and I won't lie, there are subjects I am certainly not sitting on the fence on. So on the issue of crime, for example, I could be quite absolutist in the sense that I believe people who hurt society have to pay a price. That doesn't mean that I am totally, um, utterly closed to any other point of view. I will listen to them. I might disagree, but I certainly wouldn't call for such views to be cancelled. Criticise, yes, not cancelled. There is a difference. So I want to just talk a bit about why I do take such issue with this new wokeism. I think that it's absolutist, yes, but it's how that absolutism is manifested is incredibly intolerant. If we look at a case example, the University of Sheffield last year was getting reports of students being racially abused. So what was the response? Now, a sensible response, a common sense response, would have been to find those students responsible, reprimand them, or depending on the gravity of the offence, suspend them for bullying and harassing peers, right? That would be the logical response. But what did the University of Sheffield done? It instituted a program whereby they would pay students to monitor for microaggressions. Think of the situation. You have students who have a financial incentive to basically spy on their peers over so-called microaggressions. Now, how do they define these microaggressions? Is this things like, being an obnoxious racist bigot and, calling people names because of the color of the skin? No. It's questions like, not everything, or prepositions like, not everything is about race. Where are you from? These sort of things. So, microaggressions is one of those kind of buzzwords that the new woke left like to use to define what they see as kind of a sinister undercurrent of something going on. That's mostly around race, sometimes over gender as well, but mostly, yeah, and also the trans issue. I haven't got around to reading it yet, but I think Douglas Murray in his book The Madness of Crowds will touch on a lot of this, and I look forward to reading that because I think he's someone I give a lot of weight to. Um, because I think he really takes a bull by the horn, so to speak, and he touches on a lot of the stuff. But it is deeply, deeply concerning that this is now permeating into tertiary education. Another example of this is the very widespread, very palpable campaign by the new woke left to puritanize history, for want of a better term. The bid to topple statues, particularly at the colleges of Cambridge and Oxford, but also elsewhere. Um, there is something that definitely reminds me about China's Cultural Revolution. In the 60s, Maoist students were hyped up into thinking that they needed to destroy the old China to build a new China. Now, I wouldn't make a direct analogy because we don't have a situation where people are being killed or, forced into struggle sessions publicly in the same way. Nevertheless, there is a quite a nasty undercurrent to this on absolutism. Certainly in the United States, there's been cases where academics have been hounded out of their profession from the new woke left, who are absolutely outraged at what they perceive to be outdated views. And in the UK, we see this as well. For example, academics who have offered a balanced outlook as to how we see the British Empire have been deemed to be the enemy and deemed as apologists for empire. My own view on the British Empire is it was an incredibly important event in the history of this country. It, defined modern Britain. It, in many ways, defined the modern world. It was the largest empire in history. So, absolutely, it needs to be discussed at academic level. And in discussing that, you need to hear both sides. But what the new woke left want is either no discussion at all, or if it is discussed, it should be absolute vilification and condemnation. The British Empire was motivated by greed and exploitation. It was evil, and that's it. Nothing else. No more discussion. That's basically what they're proposing. What I say is, yes, let's talk about the exploitation. Let's talk about the greed. Let's talk about murders that were committed. Some terrible things happened, but let's have a balanced outlook. Let's also look at the positive side. For example, the Westminster system of government, the rule of law, the jury system, um, advances in infrastructure building, for example. There's a lot of things that you can look at. The spread of British culture, spread of the English language. There's a lot of areas that need to be looked at objectively. Um, but that tertiary level education side of things is, I think, one of the most concerning things, particularly the teaching of critical race theory. Conservatives and Republicans in the United States have pushed back against this with the emergence that school boards were actually telling white children that they should be ashamed of themselves. Let that sink in. Telling white children that they should be ashamed of themselves because of ancestral wrongs. Meanwhile, by extension, they're telling black and other minority children that they're perpetual victims. I loathe critical race theory because I don't think it builds bridges. I don't think it builds progress, most particularly for those that it's supposedly helping. I mean, you cannot build progress if you're telling people that every single challenge they face in life must come down to systemic racism. Um, I suppose I should say that there is an unhelpful conservative counter, which is to deny that there's any problems. That is not helpful. There are problems. And you do get these Karen types in the United States, and I don't like using the term. I'm just saying it so people know what I'm referring to, who are quite entitled. And, there's been videos, for example, you get a black delivery driver, and middle class white woman comes out and gives him a hard time. I don't blame someone in that position being angry and feeling that is motivated by racism, because it probably is. It probably is motivated by racial prejudice. But the thing is, do you use an example like that, one entitled person with a bad attitude, do you use that to condemn wider white society? That's where I think it gets very problematic when you start getting into this realm of judging people by the group. I mean, surely the epitome of being open minded is not to judge people by the group. If you were to get a white counter argument that was to say, well, let's look at the Bloods and the Crips gangs, right? Every black man must be a criminal. That would be wrong. That overview would be wrong because it would be prejudiced. Not every black man is a criminal. You could say that in cities like Chicago and Baltimore and St. Louis, it is a real problem with black on black crime, and it is. And I personally think that, for example, rap culture, R&B culture has a lot to answer for in terms of glorifying criminal lifestyle, drugs, fast money, um, violence, womanizing, all that sort of stuff. I do think it has a toxic influence, but you can't say that that's every black person. It's a generalization. I've always had an instinctive opposition to any sort of generalization. But why is it bigoted to, talk about that sort of stuff, but it's not bigoted to talk about white privilege, so-called white privilege? My counter to white privilege has always been you cannot have a one size fits all. You cannot say that a homeless white person is on par with Bill Gates because they are both white. What that does is it totally dismisses people's individual lived experience. You could have a white person who had a mother who was a prostitute, a father who was a heroin addict, who became homeless at 15, who, has a whole range of mental health problems, that has had no real luck in life. Now, how the hell are they privileged? So that's what I bitterly resent about that sort of thing. And actually, it's very clever. It's very manipulative, but it's very clever because it creates a very simple dynamic that's if a white person speaks out against critical race theory, oh, well, of course they're saying that. They're privileged. So it's actually a very clever and manipulative way to shut down arguments. I've seen this in the States. You get something like BuzzFeed, which is kind of woke central. But BuzzFeed is always coming out with these videos, that's race baiting, but only race baiting one side, i.e., um, having a go at men, having a go at white people. If you're a white straight male, you're basically target number one for the average woke ideologue. And I'm well aware that there are white straight men who are woke ideologues, but they kind of think that by self-flagellating, they have the moral high ground. They don't. They really, really don't. I think they're useful idiots, but not useful idiots against the white people. Useful idiots against people with common sense. What's encouraging is on both sides of the Atlantic, you have minority people, you have LGBT people, you have women countering this stuff and saying, well, actually, this ideology doesn't define us. So, in the case of women, militant third wave feminists do not define every woman, they don't define every single woman's outlook. Um, for LGBT people, the militant gay lobby, or let's say the recent antics of Stonewall, the magazine and campaign group, doesn't define the feelings of every LGBT person. Um, the actions of BLM does not define every black person. There is an increasing number of black voices speaking out against BLM. One example in the UK is Esther Kraiku, who is a conservative activist. She's from Ghana originally, and she's very critical of BLM. So the voice of black conservatives, they're kind of being dismissed as, oh well, you're enabling the white privilege, and they get even worse slurs than that. But people are individuals. I refuse to be judged because I'm a white guy, or because I'm a straight guy, or because I'm a man. And I will fight back anyone who is hostile to me for those reasons. I've called friends and contacts on social media who have pigeonholed me that way. I don't want an echo chamber. I don't mind disagreeing with people. I don't mind people disagreeing with me. And I'm proud that I have friends from a wide range of backgrounds. But there is a limit. I have self-respect, and I'm not going to tolerate, as I had a French feminist former friend, she was really getting into a realm of because you're a man. And I said, well, to hell with that. Goodbye. I don't need to put up with that. But anyway, to get back to the subject matter, I really think that on an optimistic side, there is a lot of common sense out there. It's hard to believe sometimes, but there is. The average person just wants to get on with their life. They just want to, go to work, raise their family, whatever it is they do. And they don't really want to engage in these culture wars. I have to say though, I find it pretty incredible when you get the likes of the Guardian and the Independent suggesting that it is conservatives who are pushing the culture wars. Now, you might get some conservatives who relish it and who maybe do sometimes engage in debates that are not, or rather, jousting that isn't particularly helpful. Like, for example, I'm not a fan of the little memes that you see going around with that stupid frog creation you get in some conservative circles. I think it's immature and I don't think it really counters anything. Another big criticism I have of conservatives who are anti woke is their belief that Donald Trump is the answer. He's the medicine, he's the counter. He's not. Any self respecting conservative should be embarrassed by Donald Trump. I don't think he's the answer to this problem. And I say that in the present tense because, you know, it's widely believed that he's going to make a bid again in 2024 for the presidency. So Donald Trump is not going to go away from this debate. And I think it would be a big mistake for moderate conservatives to see Donald Trump as the common sense answer to this. Trump's a demagogue. He's also a liar. And yeah, I am no fan of Donald Trump. Um, but I do think there needs to be a common sense pushback against this stuff. And there is, to be fair, there's groups like the Campaign for Common Sense, and there's a few others, their names temporarily elude me. But, you know, if you look around, there is that's a good thing. That's a point of optimism. There is a lot of people out there who know that these culture wars are not helping anyone and they push back against it. And that's not just older people, it's not just younger people, it's a wide range of people, including, by the way, many millennials. Sometimes, as a millennial, I notice that we hear these things millennial snowflakes and millennial wokes. I'm a millennial. I don't like wokeism. I don't like political correctness. I don't like overt sensitivity. So, you know, don't make the mistake of thinking it's just the domain of millennials. In fact, I would point out that a lot of the influence of this woke ideology comes from baby boomer academics. You know, they're the people that coined the terms like white privilege and mansplaining and all the rest of it. Um, I think the best way to counter this certainly expose the double standard, certainly expose the intolerance and the hyperbole, but also I think there's a positive way to combat it as well, which is to call for consistency. And if you are someone like myself who really, really does believe in transparency, in fair play, and justice, it is important to call out racism and sexism and other forms of prejudice when they do happen, because I think that conservatives do themselves no favors if they deny it. Um, a particular point of to look at with this is police brutality. Okay, we can criticize Black Lives Matter. We can criticize the fact that it clearly has racist components. I have a big problem with BLM with some of the racist components they have, and the fact they've done nothing to expel those components. Um, I keep mentioning Yusra Kigali. As far as I know, she's never been expelled from BLM. She's the Toronto co-founder who came out with really inflammatory comments about white people, racist comments. Um, you know, I take issue with BLM for their failure to condemn black criminality because they haven't done so. Their outrageous far left ideas like, you know, let's get rid of jails, let's defund the police, that sort of thing is mind numbingly stupid. Black victims of crime will suffer as a result. Indeed, the irony is Sasha Johnson, the young woman who was shot recently, Black Lives Matter activist, under her philosophy, under the philosophy of Black Lives Matter, the people who shot her, you know, they're black suspects. Oh, well, you can't investigate them because that would be racist. So they're shooting themselves in the foot. I don't mean, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, not to be insensitive, but that's a reality. They are, they're creating a Frankenstein's monster with this because they're advocating anarchy. I've just read that the entire riot squad of Portland police force has been dismissed. Now, that to me, I don't know the precise circumstances of what's happened there, but Portland is one of those cities. like Minneapolis, like other American cities that are Democrat led, that are becoming, they're turning into just scenes of anarchy, where it's more from legitimate concern about police brutality to basically advocacy of criminality. I mean, there's an unhelpful thing that BLM has done, which is to treat every single shooting involving a black man as an example of police brutality or an example of racism without looking at the individual circumstances of each case. It's like a one size fits all. I truly believe there are people in the US that will go out and join a protest or even riot without knowing the full details of a particular case. And I think BLM has a lot to answer for in that regard. Um, but anyway, I think it's very possible to criticize Black Lives Matter without denying that, yes, there is police brutality. And yes, this is wrong. Police officers should not be above the law. You know, I have no more desire to see corrupt officers get off the hook than a BLM activist has, because I could be a victim of them as well. And that's another aspect, incidentally. There's been white victims of police brutality in America that just haven't got the same level of attention, at least from the media, as black victims have. There was a guy in, I believe it was California, homeless man, white guy. He was basically beaten to death by the police, and the autopsy photos were horrendous. Now, there was an investigation and there was localized protests. I think it was San Jose, but don't quote me on that. It was somewhere in California. Um, but, you know, no coverage at CNN, no mainstream coverage in that sense. They certainly didn't keep it in the public domain if they did have coverage. So it's clear double standards at play here. I think basically I'll conclude with this. What is so important is that those of us who believe in common sense, those of us who believe in consistency, must not allow either the far right or the far left to bully us. And I do believe that the new woke left is definitely they're absolutists, they're totalitarians. It is so important that we do push back, because if we don't, we'll start seeing it's one thing them just mouthing off and being intolerant and coming out with the nonsense. But when it starts to get into legislation, that's the real danger, because it's very hard to go back from legislation. So I'm thinking of things like criminalizing someone using the wrong pronoun. There was a recent case where a woman got dismissed from her work because she insisted that men cannot give birth. Um, and the hearings actually found ruled in her favor. What had happened was, I think she went to an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal, and they ruled in her favor. So sometimes common sense does prevail. Nevertheless, people shouldn't be going through that sort of stress and that sort of legal ordeal simply for having an opinion. Um, and I think we really need to push back against, for example, the trans lobby who want to really bully people into conformity. There has been a back against Stonewall, which was a charity that, it got praise in the past because they were advocates for LGBT rights, and they were campaigning at a time when it wasn't that easy to do so. But they have now become the bullies. They're now making demands and saying you agree with us, otherwise we will target you. We will, go out of our way to destroy you. There's this absolutist thing going on, and it's very unhealthy. By all means, people can be compassionate, passionate about an issue, but there has to be a point where there is some pushback to this. And I say everyone who believes in common sense, who believes in reason, not only is it defending yourself, it's also speaking up for others. An example I would quote is Will Noland, the lecturer who was expelled from can't remember if Eton. Yeah, I was going to say I couldn't remember if it was Eton or Harrow Eton. I signed petitions. People advocate for him. Students advocate for him. So it's extremely important that if you see injustice, if you see someone being a victim of this woke absolutism, whether that be defined by third wave feminism, whether it be Stonewall bullying people, or whether it be Black Lives Matter bullying people, I think it's very important to stand up for individuals. If you don't, you could be next if you have opinions on any of these matters. So it's very important, I think, to speak out, to try and do what you can do. I'm not saying get into a face-to-face fiery row with some woke activist, but they have to understand they don't get to dictate. You cannot have, and I actually do feel that they are a minority making demands of the majority. They could just push their way around like that. They can have their opinion, but they need to understand that people will push back and they have a right to push back. And, I'll close with this. I loathe the way that the woke left in particular, the left more broadly, it has to be said, but particularly the woke left weaponize terms like racism. They use it as a weapon because as soon as they throw out that word, if you have concerns about assimilation, if you feel that immigration needs to be controlled, anything like that, no matter how diplomatically or reasonably you put it, they'll brand you a racist, a far right reactionary. It's loathsome, it's manipulative, it's dishonest, and it requires a degree of courage, moral courage, in standing up to these people, not letting them define what is right and wrong, not letting them bully you into silence, but also being consistent. That's why I always say, in combating the woke left, it's also important to combat the far right and the intolerance on the other side. Because if, for example, you're condemning the woke left for critical race theory, but you do turn a blind eye when someone is a victim of a vicious racist attack, then, it weakens your moral position. So it's very important to not to prove to them, but to be consistent for the sake of your own values. And that's what I try to do. Thanks for listening.